Good day, everyone. I am Jim Hake, the founder and CEO at Spirit of America. And thank you all for joining us. I'm very happy to see so many of our supporters, including members of our board of directors and advisory board, on the call today. And I want to thank you all for the support that you provide that lets us do the work you're going to hear about today, focused on the Middle East. For those of you who don't know Spirit of America, we are a privately funded 501c3 nonprofit, and we unite Americans with America's troops and diplomats in common cause. We provide private assistance to help our troops and diplomats save lives, defend freedom, and really strengthen the front lines of democracy in some of the world's toughest places, including in the Middle East. So you can think about it as Spirit of America filling the gaps between what needs to be done and what government can do. And right now, our team is active in Ukraine, Taiwan, West Africa, and of course, the Middle East, which we're going to be talking about. For example, one of the things we're doing in the Middle East is supporting the Peshmerga in Iraqi Kurdistan, and their role as a key bulwark against the expansion of Iran's aggression in the region. So we have today Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who I'll introduce in a second, and Alan Reyes, our Chief of International Operations. Ambassador Crocker is a tremendous and longtime friend of Spirit of America. He served as America's ambassador to 6 critical countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. And among other things, he's been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And he is also an honorary United States Marine, which I have to point out, you may know less about than the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but it's an even greater distinction than the Medal of Freedom. And we're very honored to have Ambassador Crocker serve on Spirit of America's advisory board. So Ambassador Crocker, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for being a member of the Spirit of America team.
Thank you, Jim.
I want to start off with a broader question. If you could just give a brief assessment of the situation in the Middle East, and what are the, say, 2 or 3 things you think are most important for people to, on this call to know about?
Well, clearly the Middle East is back in the headlines. Successive administrations have talked about pivoting away from the Middle East, Obama, Trump, and Biden. But the Middle East has a way of taking a bite out of your backside when you try and turn in the other direction. And we've certainly seen that in this past year since the horrific attacks by Hamas on Israel on October 7th and in the Israeli response. And now, of course, we're looking at a much wider war as Hezbollah has engaged more intensely and Israel has responded more intensely. And now, of course, we're looking again at the prospect of direct Israel-Iran conflict. So a bad situation, it being the Middle East, always has the possibility of getting way worse. All of that said, it's important to look at what hasn't happened in the region in this tumultuous year since October 7, 2023. The Arab states have not engaged against Israel. Indeed, thanks to the Abraham Accords forged under President Trump, that brought 3 more Arab states into formal peace treaties with Israel. Those formal peace treaties have all stayed intact. Embassies have stayed open of the Arab states in Israel and Israel's embassies in the Arab states. We do not have mass demonstrations against Israel in Arab streets. There are probably more demonstrations in the US and Europe than there are in the Arab world itself, for lots of complex reasons for that. But what I take from this as slightly heartening is that Israel is an accepted entity in the Middle East. Iran is the outlier in this. And the more Iran engages itself against Israel, I think the more you will have tacit Arab support for Israel. So that is the very highly qualified good news. I think the real danger here is that the obvious weaknesses that this conflict has now exposed vis-a-vis Iran's military capabilities may push them even faster and harder toward development of a nuclear weapons option. Their ballistic missile attack of 10 days ago did not succeed to any great degree. And that was really kind of their best shot. And I would imagine that the debate is very intense now in Tehran on moving to develop a nuclear option. So I actually see more danger in the long term of almost existential conflict than I do in the short to medium term.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question on that. But for everyone listening in, watching, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and I'll do my best to get to them during our half hour today. So please use that Q&A button. Ambassador Crocker, with Iran's potential accelerated development of nuclear weapons, did they really need an incentive to do that more quickly than they had before this recent conflict?
Well, I go back a fair distance in the Middle East, and it seems to me that 15 years ago, there was a conversation much like today that Iran was a year or less away from a nuclear weapon. So it's 15 years on, and they still haven't developed it. But I worry that the capabilities are definitely there, and not just the physical resources, which can be interdicted, but the intellectual resources that they know how to build a bomb have not yet done so. Again, there are very strong reasons for them not to build a device, but I do worry that as their conventional military weakness vis-a-vis Israel is increasingly clear to them and to the region and the world, that that's going to push the debate in the direction of nuclearizing.
And one of the questions that came in as you were speaking was, do you think Israel should or will take out some of Iran's nuclear capacity?
I think the question, that is part of the question. The real question is, can they? Again, I go back a long way in the Middle East. I was in the region when Israel bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor. That was back in 1981. So the Islamic Republic has had decades to consider how to make any nuclear facilities they may develop survivable from air attack. And that, I think, is the Israeli option, an attack from the air. No one is talking about massive numbers of boots on the ground to eradicate a nuclear facility from the ground. So could they? Yes. Will they? Well, the administration is trying to dissuade them from that option. Can they? Because the one thing worse than a strike on a nuclear facility would be a strike on a nuclear facility that is not successful. So these are all complex issues that are being weighed, of course, in Jerusalem, in Washington, and of course in Tehran.
We have a number of questions that came in on this subject, which I'll try to get to in a moment. But with respect to, you and I have talked before about Iran's, as really any state, their main objective is to maintain the power and sovereignty of their state. So I can understand why a nuclear capability would serve that goal, but why does their aggression in the region, both against U.S. troops through their proxies and against Israel, why does that aggression and malign behavior serve that purpose of maintaining their power?
I think, Jim, you've got to look at Iran's place in the region and the international arena as seen from Tehran. Iran has always been a regional power. You can take that back to the era of Cyrus the Great and the Sasanians and the Safavid empires. The Shah had extensive ambitions as well during his rule, in which he expanded Iran's influence beyond its borders using its conventional forces, its navy in the Persian Gulf to seize 3 islands from the newborn United Arab Emirates, and its army in the Arabian Peninsula, fighting at the invitation of the Sultan of Oman. The Ayatollahs, the theocracy in Iran after the 79 revolution, has basically been working from the same imperial playbook, except instead of using conventional forces, they are using unconventional forces, proxy militias, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, an assortment of largely Shia militias in Iraq to project power beyond their borders. So that is consistent, I think, with Iran's strategic logic, which is not exactly new. It goes back not just decades or centuries, but millennia. Now, I would argue that they have overplayed their hand, and they are now seeing the results of that. I don't see any evidence that Iran was involved in planning or had any foreknowledge of the October 7th attack, but it is guilt by association, clearly. And of course, there are direct links between Tehran and Hezbollah, which has been subjecting northern Israel to rocket barrages for a year now that, frankly, are not tolerable on the part of the Israeli population. So now they're seeing a backlash that runs the risk of devastating damage in Iran itself. So I would argue that they've overplayed their hand, but the logic of their expansionism, I think, is thoroughly rooted in a millennia-old strategic vision that isn't going to change.
And what's your assessment of the U.S. approach towards Iran?
It's a great question, and I think that what we're seeing in the Middle East is a bad hand played quite well by the administration to make clear right from the outset strong support for Israel in the aftermath of the October 7 attacks. That has not wavered. It has not been popular in this country and certainly elsewhere in the world, but the administration has stuck by it. At the same time, making clear concern over the means that are used to achieve Israel's objective against Hamas, that the collateral damage has been extensive. And now we're looking at collateral damage in Lebanon, something we've seen before and now we're seeing again. So we see, I think, both the necessity of strong U.S. engagement, but also the limits on what we can do. It also applies to Iran. There, of course, the dialogue is a little more strained. We don't have diplomatic relations. We don't have direct contacts. But clearly, the administration has been engaged with Iran to caution them against any further escalation, to point out to them that they are facing international opprobrium for what they've done in its support for Hamas, and also in particular its support for Hezbollah, as well as the Houthis. So Iran is finding itself fairly isolated, and the United States, I think, has been effective in building up an international consensus against Iran's malign activities in the face of, again, significant international criticism of Israel's own pursuit of its strategic objectives. So again, I think this all demonstrates the importance of U.S. leadership in the region, but also the limitations on U.S. influence.
And reportedly, there are about 40,000 U.S. troops in the Middle East, which often I found surprises people. Could you give just an overview of why they're there and a little bit, well, why they're there, maybe what they're doing, please?
Well, the United States has been engaged militarily in the Middle East literally since World War II. We've had a naval presence based in Bahrain since the late 1940s. We have a military presence on the ground up and down the Arabian Peninsula, uh, on the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, and have had for some time. We have deployed forces in Syria, in Iraq, and in Jordan. And again, these are relatively small numbers of troops that I think have fulfilled some vital U.S. interests in helping maintain the security of the Gulf area, of giving us a forward presence and a forward basing capability that was crucial, for example, to our prosecution of the war in in Afghanistan. And by and large, with the exception of our deployments in Iraq and Syria, it is below the radar. We don't, you don't hear of U.S. forces in the region, and that is good news. But they have been there because it is vital to America's national security and economic interests. They have been there for some time, and we certainly hope to see them there for some time into the future.
Well, as you know, Iraqi Kurdistan has been a major focus of Spirit of America's activities. Could you say a little bit about, the role that Kurdistan plays in America's interest in the region?
Well, first, if you'd permit me, Jim, I'd like to say just a word about the role of Spirit of America in the region and globally. It is a unique humanitarian NGO in that it is not neutral. We are on the side of the U.S. government and its deployed elements, and those are the three Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. And we are in support of all of those missions. And I think you see that in particular in Iraqi Kurdistan, where it is a very, very delicate political situation. The Iraqi Kurds have suffered horribly at the hands of the Saddam Hussein regime that ruled Baghdad until 2003, that was involved in literally genocidal actions, the use of poison gas against civilian populations in Iraqi Kurdistan. It's also suffered from Iran. At the time of the revolution, tens of thousands of Kurds were executed by the new theocratic regime in Iranian Kurdistan. So it is a very tense, fraught area populated by people who have paid dearly for their pursuit of a life of independence and some prosperity and security for their families. And yet the going is very delicate. And that is why I think Spirit of America's activities in Kurdistan are so important. But it also underscores the importance of working so closely with the U.S. government, both its military and its diplomatic and developmental efforts in that same region. Because, again, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria may have very different perspectives on many things, but one thing they're all unified on is opposition to any independent Kurdistan. All four states see that as an existential threat to them. And that means U.S. involvement there has to be very carefully nuanced and measured, and very closely aligned again with Washington's larger policy objectives. And I think Spirit of America has demonstrated how a non-governmental organization with close ties to the administration, whichever administration it is, can be agile and effective in furthering humanitarian goals, but also American strategic goals.
Well, thank you. So let me ask Alan, we have a number of questions I'm going to come back to from the audience here. But Alan, in light of what Ambassador Crocker said, both about the region and the role of and importance of Iraqi Kurdistan, could you just say a few words about, to let folks know what we're doing there and how it relates to Ambassador Crocker's comments, please?
Sure, will do. As Ambassador Crocker mentioned, really on the three Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development, and in working very closely with our U.S. government partners, both in the consulate there in Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as the U.S. military partners that are there to strengthen our partner forces in the Peshmerga. We work to find ways to hit each one of those three Ds, as he mentioned. So as an example, we work very closely with the U.S. military, advising the Peshmerga, providing them non-lethal military support that will help them be a better force, both against particularly as a bulwark against Iranian aggression. From the diplomacy standpoint, we work closely with the U.S. consulate and other U.S. State Department personnel to provide means to improve the awareness and the communication of American and Kurdistan partnership and the strength of that partnership, and ensuring that that is known across the region, and particularly in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And then finally, in development, we're working closely again with the U.S. State Department, but also with NGOs there in Kurdistan to strengthen the development of youth advocacy, youth support, and the ability to foster entrepreneurial activity there in Iraq, because obviously multiple dimensions of national power beyond diplomacy and information and military economic power is also one that we want to help cultivate for this very important bulwark against the Iranian aggression.
Thank you, Alan. And Ambassador Crocker, this is probably longer than even the next 9 minutes would allow for. But with your perspective both on the region and experience with Spirit of America, is there anything that we should be thinking about, considering doing to be helpful in the region beyond what you're aware of that we're doing right now?
I think that, again, our close relationship with the administration is crucial to identify those areas where, as you have done so brilliantly in Ukraine, where we can make a difference through the application of a relatively small amount of resources, but mainly speed and agility, to make a difference to our interests in a conflict zone. So just maintaining that dialogue is important. The other element that I think is very important is to continue doing what Spirit of America is doing to just increase the consciousness of Americans on the significance of the Middle East and the international sphere generally, that what happens outside our borders directly affects our own prosperity and our very security. And I think that informational element is extremely important back home to highlight why we're doing what we're doing and why that is important in a way that affects every American.
Thank you. I'm going to get to a few of the questions from our audience. One comes from retired Colonel, Marine Colonel Al Burgard, who, just for everyone's context here, was one of the first two deployed U.S. military personnel that we worked with at Spirit America back in 2003. So Al, thanks for being with us today, and thank you for your question. Colonel Burgard, Ambassador Crocker notes the attacks on our embassy in the Marine barracks long ago, and he asks, what lessons should U.S. leadership, elected and military, recall given the decades of strife in the area and the prospect of U.S. forces becoming more embroiled? So what are the lessons that you look back on that we should keep in mind for actions and policy today?
Yeah, well, we're all shaped by our personal histories, and my personal history was immensely impacted by my time in Beirut in the early 1980s. I survived the embassy bombing April 1983 and was still there when the Marine barracks exploded 6 months later in October of that year. So there are a couple of enduring lessons I've taken away from those experiences. The first is be careful what you get into. The laws of unintended consequence apply with particular force in the Middle East. And I think that is especially salient now as we look at the current conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. In some respects, it's like 1982 all over again. That was the massive Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon to eliminate the military capabilities of the PLO, an action that we are said to have tacitly supported, the famous yellow light. Well, the consequences of that particular military action called Operation Peace for Galilee. Again, this is 1982, 42 years ago. That has not exactly brought peace to Galilee 42 years later. The PLO was eliminated as a military force and replaced by something far more lethal, which was Hezbollah. Syria was backing the Lebanese and Palestinian fighters at the time. That space has now been taken by Iran, which has provided far more lethal support than the Syrians ever managed. So again, for the United States, be careful what you get into. We got into Lebanon basically seen as a protagonist in a hugely complex civil war, and we paid for it with a horrific loss of military and diplomatic lives. The Israelis paid far more. By the time they finally withdrew completely from Lebanon in 2000, after 18 years on Lebanese ground, they'd lost 1,100 IDF troopers and really achieved nothing strategically. So there's a real lesson here, I think, for the United States and for Israel as they, again, launch a ground offensive into Lebanon. What's the strategy? What's the day after program? That military occupation by Israel created Hezbollah. It is not going to eliminate Hezbollah. So what's the plan for the day after? These are the questions that I think are intensely being engaged now in Jerusalem and in Washington. And I hope that our two countries can come up with some better answers than we did in the early 80s.
What's your assessment of the likelihood of better answers?
Well, it's the Middle East, so there are no good answers. I became used to saying, we don't have good options here. We have bad options. We have worse options. There are a couple of UN Security Council resolutions on the books. 1701, that was passed after the 2006 Hezbollah-Israel war, calling for a complete withdrawal of non-Lebanese forces, the disarming of all militias, the deployment of the Lebanese armed forces, and a strengthened United Nations force in southern Lebanon. That may be a place to start, at least to start a conversation. It may be that at this point that Hezbollah would see at least a tactical advantage, and Iran as well, in a halt to the fighting, because they're certainly on the losing end of it. And that halt might allow Israeli civilians to return to their homes in northern Israel. Buying time is a good investment in the Middle East. And focus on Resolution 1701 might be a way of getting a little time to see if in that breathing space that some longer term solutions are possible, but I would not be optimistic.
Thank you. A question from a fellow advisory board member, Ambassador Ron Newman, that relates a little bit to be careful what you get into. As you pointed out, if Israel attacks Iran, the nuclear capability, without consultation with the U.S., what is the American obligation to protect Israel from whatever counterstrike comes from Iran?
I think the administration has been clear on that our commitment to Israel's security is absolute. And that as we demonstrated in the latest attack on Israel from Iran, we are there and we have capabilities that we will deploy in defense of Israel. So the Iranians should be under no illusion that any further actions they contemplate against Israel or against any other friendly element in the Middle East, including our own forces, is going to be met with force and determination by the United States. I think Secretary Austin has been very clear on that. And as has the president and the vice president. So we will definitely, if Iran chooses to pursue a further escalation, they should have no illusion that they will be met by whatever force is necessary to defend our allies and our interests in the region.
Great, thank you. We are at time. So, Alan, thank you for joining us. Ambassador Crocker, thank you so much for sharing your experience and insights with us today. We are proud and honored, more than I could tell you, about having you as a member of our team. So thank you for everything that you bring to our coalition of the Can Do. And for everyone else, thanks for being with us today. If you're interested in the work that we're doing in the Middle East, please visit us at spiritofamerica.org. If that looks interesting to you, please reach out, help us do more. And again, thank you all for being with us. Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for all that Spirit of America is doing.